So, welcome back to Advanced Image Synthesis. Today we've got high dynamic range imaging. And before I start with it, quick reminder to all students at the University Duisburg-Essen, either when you watch this live or when you watch this as a video on demand, please fill out the evaluation form. So there's still only very few evaluations that have been filled out. So I suppose there are more students around attending the class. Yeah, hi. That said, what is a high dynamic range imaging? Well, and how does that fit into advanced image synthesis? Well, it's kind of, you might think that this is sort of at the end of the pipeline. It's like, how do we display high dynamic range data? But it's actually something that you can integrate very early on into what's wrong today? Into your rendering process. And hence it makes sense to consider this from the start. So what is HDRI or HDR or HD, video HD imaging? What's that anyways? And it's one of those interesting things that when I talked about this a couple of years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I actually had to explain this in a lot of detail because it was technology that hardly anyone knew. Until relatively recently, I would say maybe 2 or 3 years ago, HDR, as it's usually called, has had sort of a renaissance because mainstream TV manufacturers started to integrate that technology into their devices, and then it also required some integration into players, other hardware along the way, such as switches, video switches, or just simply the sources, right? So your Blu-ray or HD, what are they called? Ultra HD discs, or your streaming media now streams some content in high dynamic range. So it's nowadays something that you've heard about. But what is it really? And what is it all about? And what does it take? So, and this is what today's stream will be about. So high dynamic range imaging is, and you can see here in the background, that's a high dynamic range photograph. Is a technology that tries to capture, a high dynamic range. What that means is that there's a high difference between relatively small and relatively large values. And in particular, in such a night scene here, there's parts that are literally 100% black, that are pitch dark. And then there's parts in the scene that are relatively bright, where you have flashlights or something, right? Very bright lights. You also have HDR in sunlit scenarios, where the sun is a very bright light source. You don't have a pitch black part in your environment, but since the light source is so black, you also have a high dynamic range. So high dynamic range really means you have a big difference between something dark and something bright, and that causes some trouble. So here, here's a sequence of photographs that I took of a neighbor's house. And what you can see at the top, those are 3 different photographs taken with different exposures. So if I run my camera and I can take a very short exposure, I get the image on the right. And if I do a fairly long exposure, I get the image on the left. Now, what's interesting to notice is that there's parts of the scene, and those images were taken in quick succession, so the scene hasn't changed. But there are parts in the scene that are visible only on the left, and some are only visible on the right. And the center is sort of in between. It's the medium time exposure, right? Examples are the garage is visible on the left, whereas it's dark, it's black on the right. And other things such as the, pretty much the entire house is just overexposed on the left. It's almost entirely white, but we can see it in the center and in the right image. And in particular, the reflection in the window, which is probably the brightest part in the scene, that has some structure on the right, but it's completely saturated on the left. Now I can take those images and combine them into a single image and process them in a way so that they're still in the same range that a single image can display, to get something like this here that has structure pretty much everywhere. Like the garage is visible, the house is visible, there's structure in the window. It doesn't look very realistic anymore, so I crank this up to a point where it's more an artistic kind of painting sort of thing, but that's what you get when you take data that has a very high dynamic range, meaning big difference, bright, dark, and you try to crunch this together so that it fits into a limited range of data. And that's, yeah, what HDR is about. It's not a very recent technology. I mentioned that fairly recently. TV manufacturers in particular picked this up, and then again sources and intermediate devices also had to kind of go along with that. But it's actually a pretty old technology, right? So here's an image from 1856 that is already an HDR image. So it's a composite of two separate photographs. So one scene was shot with a camera, of course, an analog camera, and the sky was exposed differently than the rest, like water, boat, and land here at the bottom. In this case, it was fairly simple to composite the two images. So all the photographer had to do was cut the image at this straight line here and then combine it back into one. But yeah, HDR is really a pretty old idea. So it had existed for a fairly long time. And in particular, in the old days with analog cameras and like really analog devices here, right? It was even harder to get this together, to put this together. Okay, so yeah, it's kind of an old idea, but again, recently it's picked up some traction, and I guess the reason is that, well, I guess industry ran out of other ideas really, right? So I mean, what industry is trying to do is, of course, they're trying to sell hardware, and I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. They're trying to make money, trying to sell hardware, and there were developments over the last 20, 30 years that kind of justified buying a new TV, right? So we had a transition from like CRTs, tube big TVs, to flat panel TVs. So those were usually much bigger while still requiring significantly less space. Then we had an increase in resolution. So from the old 720p resolution, which was actually way more than TV already, to whatever 1080p to 2K, 4K. Well, no one cares about 8K because generally that is indistinguishable. But we've run into kind of a situation where increasing the resolution doesn't make any sense. Making the TV thinner doesn't make any sense. I mean, it shouldn't fall apart, right? Various illumination techniques have been tried. Also, there were plasma TVs, LED TVs, LCDs, where that's sort of the same, or using CRT as background illumination. OLED screens, mini LEDs, micro LEDs. So there's various illumination techniques, but all of those things have reached a state where even if there's a new soccer world championship or European championship, it doesn't necessarily make you buy a new TV. So what the industry came up with is, well, okay, let's try HDR. That's another thing that we haven't done so far. And what's interesting about this, that this is obviously the reproduction part, right? Your TV is responsible for reproducing the final image, well, if you want to watch it on a TV, that you see, okay? So, but there's a whole pipeline in front of that, that you need to be aware of. And in particular, if you do not have an HDR TV, or if you have what industry calls HDR these days, which is far away from what I would consider real high dynamic range output, you still have to do a couple of things to get this to work. So here's another image. That's a more recent image that I just grabbed from, I think, Wikipedia. And here's another one, which again over exaggerates also some of the illumination effects to create this artistic effect. None of the images that you see here, well, this one or that one or this one here, is displayed on an HDR device, at least most likely. I mean, you might have an HDR TV, but I'm not broadcasting in HDR. So none of this is really high dynamic range output. So it's been pre-processed to kind of create a similar sensation, similar visual sensation as if it would have high dynamic range, as if there would be difference between bright and dark parts. So that's kind of the basic idea of processing high dynamic range data, and the process is often referred to as tone mapping. More on that in a couple of minutes. So again, what is HDR? HDR is treating things that have a significant luminance or brightness difference between dark and bright parts. So if you have an image that is all bright, or if you have an image that is all dark, it doesn't require HDR, right? But you often have the situation where there's a significant difference between the two. And an HDR device should be able to handle around 1 to 10,000 difference between the darkest and the brightest spot. So that's what you would generally consider HDR, but it can go way beyond that. So I already mentioned tone mapping. What is tone mapping? Well, that's technically a process that takes a color image and turns it into a color image, okay? And what it does is it takes HDR content, wherever that comes from, whether it was rendered or whether it was acquired, captured by a camera system, and converts that into SDR, which stands for standard dynamic range, or just normal image, in a way that it looks sort of similar. Okay, whatever that means. You see that I'm kind of hand wavy here, and that's on purpose. So this idea of recreating the same visual sensation is very subjective. And that also has the effect, there's a ton of different tone mapping techniques around, and each one's better than all of the others. So, and it doesn't really work out very well, but it's all a thing that works for specific situations, maybe better, or for specific observers. So, what do you need to do to get HDR to run? And there's a couple of things. Like the whole pipeline has to be in some way or another HDR. So the first one is, how do we record data? So there's obviously two sources of image data. One is rendered imagery and the other one is acquired or captured imagery. I won't really talk about rendered imagery much because here's the thing. Well, simply run your ray tracer, rasterizer, photon mapper, radiosity render, whatever. Simply run this in double precision. You're good to go. Okay. So if you want to get a dynamic range from 1 to 10,000, I mean, half precision will do. Okay, half is 16-bit floating point, right? Which is very rare. But even if you do half precision, fine. If you do floating point, 32 bits, fine. If you want to do the total overkill computation, do it in double precision, 64-bit. You're good to go. So your data will be HDR. Okay, so you just have to make sure that your entire rendering pipeline can process double, right? Which might be a problem if you're using standard graphics hardware, because they're usually using 8-bit. But if you just do a ray tracer or you spend a little bit of time, it's okay. So that's why I don't care too much about the rendering, because none of the equations, none of the math changes. It's just executed with more precision. Okay. So hence let's talk about acquired data. Okay, so that'll be the recording part, and then we talk about storage, which again concerns both acquired as well as computed data, and ultimately processing if it can't be output directly, which HDR data cannot be in most cases. So here again, I have this kind of sequence of image, which is something that is often used. So this is again the same image. It's a typical HDR scenario, or it's kind of the hello world example for HDR. It's the photograph from a closed off room out of a window. Okay, and that's one of the things that when I was a little kid and I had the first video camera in my hand, I thought it was broken, because when I kind of was panning this around, you know, it's okay, it's fine as long as I'm in the room, and then it's fine when I point outside, but sort of in between, I get this awkward thing that everything turns dark and everything turns bright. Well, again, I was very little. I mean, later on I figured out, yeah, sure, I mean, the camera can't handle the difference between the very bright setup outside, it has to adjust the exposure, and the very dark setup inside, so it again has to adjust the exposure to, well, a longer exposure time. And that's obvious if you know a little bit about technology, but it's not obvious when you're not dealing with technology. If you're just using your eyes, you don't really, unless you have a significant brightness difference, right? You're from a pitch dark room, go out in the bright sunlight. Of course, this is painful and your eyes need to adjust. But under normal circumstances, right? If you have like today's illumination, you don't have to like adjust when you look outside, right? So you look in the room, it's fine. You look outside, it's fine. And you can also handle both. So that said, apparently our visual system, and again, more on that later, has a significantly higher dynamic range than the average camera. Okay, so what I did here is I again did a sequence of exposure images, and the idea is to combine that somehow ultimately to something that looks as if we were standing in the room looking at or looking towards the window, and we would be able to see stuff inside as well as outside. Okay, so and that's with a standard dynamic range media, because that's what we're generally using to output things. Okay, so how do we get there? Let's talk about recording first. And there's kind of two things, right? So we've got engineering versus nature. That's what I call this, right? So we've got pretty complicated recording hardware wired up to our brain, which we generally refer to as eyes, or the whole thing is the visual system. And that needs to somehow compete with technology. Okay, so this thing here with all its pieces of hardware, that should compete with the other technology that we can just build. Okay, so here's the rough setup. I mean, I suppose you all basically know how eyes work, but nonetheless, a few details on that. For more details, check out my stream in computer graphics on color. So I'll have a little bit of colors. I have a little bit of information on colors today, but I don't want to repeat everything that I said in the last stream on color. So if you're interested to learn more details, check out the YouTube recordings on color and color perception. But just a quick overview. So our eyes, which are just a tiny part of our visual system, that's another important aspect to understand. But our first contact to light or to visual information are our eyes. And light hits our cornea, and then it goes through the pupil, is focused by the lens, and then ultimately ends up creating an image on the retina. Okay? A few interesting things. So for instance, the cornea is really the thing that does most of the focus work, not the lens. The lens is just for adjustment, but really the cornea, that's the piece of hardware that does most of the focus, and the lens just does tiny adjustments. Okay, so that's easy to, that's actually a thing that's easy to understand, like why is that the case? Because the cornea is that piece of, let's just call it hardware, that separates air from tissue, body tissue. And most of this here is some gelatinous, pretty much water-like tissue. So we have a transition from air to water, which is a significant transition when it comes to speed of light, and hence the effect of the bending effect on light, the focusing effect on light. So this is where everything happens. If you don't believe me that the cornea is really responsible for focusing, just put your head in water, hold your breath, hopefully, put your head in water and try to see underwater. You can't focus clearly, because then you have a transition water to water, which doesn't work anymore. So, and you can do whatever you want with your lens, you'll never get a sharp image, right? So, because that transition is lost. How do you fix that? By the way, take a little bit of air, put it in front of your eyes. That's called goggles, and suddenly you can see again. So, cornea does all of the focus work. Then you get your image on the retina. And that retina is made up of a bunch of photoreceptors, well, basically cones and rods. Here is some stained tissue, so you can actually nicely see the cones here. And to keep things simple here, again, more detail on that in computer graphics. To keep things simple, we have 3 different cone types and just 1 rod type. Since we only have 1 rod type, we can't distinguish different wavelengths. It has a specific wavelength absorption or detection characteristics, more than a few seconds, but we only have 1, so we can't distinguish different wavelengths with the rods, and those are very sensitive, extremely sensitive to low light, and we use them at night. So our visual system kind of automatically switches to the rods at night and turns them on, off during daytime. We have three different cone types: short, medium, and long range detectors. I put blue, green, and red here in quotation marks because I don't like this notion of calling the cones blue, green, and red. And I'll also tell you briefly, in much more detail again in computer graphics, but briefly here, why I don't think it's a smart idea to call them this way. And in science, they're not called this way, but a lot of people think about cones as, yeah, we have red, green, and blue cones. Okay, good to go. Not really correct. My point is we have a ton of those, and they are non-uniformly distributed. So what you see here on top of me is a distribution of foveal cells. And we're just talking about the cones here. So you see the cone cells, they're colored red, green, and blue, just for the sake of assigning them a color. Okay, and what you can see, if you look closely, it might be a little bit hard to spot. I don't know how much Twitch compresses my stream today, but it might be a little bit hard to see. But if you check, there's very little blue ones, or basically no blue ones in the center. Okay, so there's the center area here, and that one has almost no blue dots in it, so it has almost no short wavelength detectors, which is an important thing to know when you design, for instance, graphics or visualization, because what this means is in the area of the maximum cone density, so which is the part where you have the maximum resolution in our retina, that center part, we can't perceive short wavelength very well, or we can't distinguish them. That's probably even better. Not necessarily perceive, but we can't distinguish them, okay? So long story short, don't design a visualization in blue. It's a dumb idea. So we've got two graphs here at the bottom. So the one on the left here, that is basically kind of the same. It's a similar visualization to that one on top, but it looks at the distribution of rods and cones. Okay, and again, you can see at the center area where we have the highest spatial resolution, the best perception. In that area, we have a lot of cones, and towards the periphery, our cone distribution significantly drops, and we have more rods. What this tells you is that at nighttime, where you use rods, don't focus on something if you want to see it, because you don't have rods, or just very few in the center. Okay, so those are all probably things to for life that might be interesting. But why is that interesting when we design a computer graphics system? Okay, so we've got a question here. So people who use blue crosshairs in shooter games are scientifically wrong. Yeah, they're total idiots. Except they put this crosshair against a white background, I would say, right? Because then it's white against something else. But blue against dark, blue against black, for instance, that wouldn't work. Right? If you have blue on white, it's okay because you can distinguish white from the thing that you can't see. Okay, it's like black on white. So this is why blue ink works. Okay, so blue ink works because it's just as good as black ink. Okay, so and that we can distinguish. But what would be a really dumb idea would be blue on black, like here. Okay, so look at this graph here. It's blue on black. It's a pretty dumb idea. I mean, check out how easy this can be seen compared to these graphs here, particularly when you focus on them, right? That's the key point. Yeah. So you always want to have a red or green crosshair in a dark setup when you would run a first-person shooter. Yeah, that gives you strategic advantage. So now let's focus on this image here a little bit. Let's make this bigger, particularly because that part is hard to see. And also notice how you would probably say, well, that's a darker color, right? Blue is, in particular, this blue is pretty dark compared to this relatively bright green here. And that, physically speaking, that is total nonsense. So all of these colors here have about the same intensity, but we perceive them differently. And perception is really the key of this graph here. So what does this graph show us? Okay, it's as you can see, it's the normalized absorbance versus the wavelength. or color. Okay, so for all intents and purposes, wavelength and color is kind of the same thing here. I even put color marks here at the bottom. Right here it says violet, blue, cyan, green, yellow, red. Okay, and that corresponds to wavelength. And most folks know this, right? So colors or light is an electromagnetic wave, and its color is determined by its wavelength. So you've hopefully learned that at school, so this is kind of common knowledge. Okay, what is not so common knowledge is how does that interplay with our visual system? Okay, so we've got these 3, or in total 4 cells, and I also included the rods here. So the rods is this white dashed line here. But if you ignore the rods for a second, and we only focus on our daytime vision, we got these long, medium, and short wavelength detectors. Now you can look at those, and we can check the peaks. Okay, so as I said, I don't like this idea of calling them blue, green, and red receptors. Okay, why is that the case? Because, well, as you can see, they spawn, like take the long range, a long wavelength detector, for instance. It pretty much spawns the entire range of wavelength. So the L detectors detect pretty much any wavelength. They detect violet, blue, cyan, green, yellow, and red. And red not even very well, to be honest, right? The response of red is actually much lower than the response for, well, yellow. Okay, so don't call them red, green, and blue, and tell the world not to do so. So the only reason I colored them here because I had to give them some color. Okay, so what does this graph mean? So that's the first thing that I should explain. I mean, it says normalized absorption. What the hell does that mean? It means if you get a signal, or if your eye receives a signal, if your photoreceptors receive a signal of a certain wavelength, okay, let's say 400 nanometers. Okay, what is their response rate? Okay, how well does a long, a medium, and in the blue case, a short wavelength detector respond to that? Okay, so those are cells. They send electrochemical signals, right? You know, this whole action potential thing. They send electrochemical signals, and how well do they do this? Do they, if I give you a certain intensity of, say, blue light or a certain intensity of yellow light, and I just literally read the signal, you can do this. I mean, you can take the nerves and can read the signals off of the nerve, right? You can check what does that neuron transport. How well do they fire? Okay? And what you can see is that the short wavelength detectors fire pretty well in the blue range and in violet here as well, and it extends to sort of green, and then they don't detect it anymore. Okay. Now, what do the red and green curves here, the long and medium wavelength detectors do? Well, they seem to have a different characteristic, and they seem to have their best response around. That's another funny thing. The red detector, where does it have its maximum? Around yellow. So if you want to give it a name, for whatever sake, call them yellow detectors, right? Because that's where their peak is. And then please call the green ones green-yellow, because that's where they are. So they are greenish-yellow. Their peak is at greenish-yellow. Okay. So this is how they react. This is how well they react. Notice one other important thing in this graph. It says normalized absorbance. Okay. So that says how well, compared to their maximum capacity, can they absorb light and hence create action potentials out of that. The truth is, so if I would display this in a non-normalized form, so I get the absolute value, you would actually see that this blue chart is way lower. It's just, since it's normalized to 1, it looks much higher. So if in a non-normalized chart, this thing would have about this curve here. So as a matter of fact, and again, that's another reason why you shouldn't call them blue ones, the red and the green ones detect blue light better than the blue ones. Okay, so the only difference is the short ones detect this light not at all. Okay, so we got a question here. So more like CMYK than RGB? Yeah, certainly, yeah, sure. Well, let's think about this for a moment. I never thought about this. Well, you could probably argue that they're closer to, yeah, so at least we got yellow in there. Okay, anyways, so, but it's very important to understand this graphic here. It's even more important to do this for computer graphics, where I talk about this way longer, but here you should also know what this means. This means how well do your receptors respond to a certain wavelength. Okay, So, and then how does your brain detect a certain color? So for instance, if you see a cyan, if you see something that is in cyan, right? So you can see that at cyan, all three detectors have, at least in their normalized shape, roughly the same response. So when the brain gets from all three detectors at one point in space, roughly the same normalized response, says, okay, well, there's cyan there. Okay, so the detection of the entire spectrum of colors is a computational result from those three separate detection curves. Okay, and this is also why it's important that these detection curves overlap, significantly overlap, and why they have different shapes. If they wouldn't overlap, if we would just have one curve, say we wouldn't have the green detectors. And actually, for some folks, these detectors are genetically broken, so they're not expressed, or for some other reason broken. And then what happens is, if you get two different colors, if you're exposed to two different colors, let's say we don't have the green ones here, right? So we're exposed to, let's say, orange, right? That's about here. Okay, then we get a certain response. And now let's look, where do we get the same response, right? We get the same response about here, and if I'm lucky, I don't get any response from the blue ones. So now I've got green and I've got a reddish orange color, and they lead to the same response. Let's say the blue ones don't detect anything here, right? And then we can't distinguish the two, and that's what's called color blindness. Okay, ever heard about red-green color blindness? Here's the explanation for that one. Okay, so, but since these shapes overlap, and since they have different shapes, or since the detectors overlap and they have different shapes, we under normal trichromatic vision, we get a response here that's a lot of L, very little M response, and here we would get more M and more L response and less L response. So this is why our brain can distinguish the two situations. So I always imagine this, that the brain has kind of a lookup table where it says, okay, well, if this is my M, L, and S response, what color is this? And in a sense, it does, right? I mean, so the neurons are wired in a way that they sort of learn these kind of lookup tables to express colors. Okay, so why is that important? More on that in a second. So a question here. Okay, well, not really a question. Okay, so another interesting thing is resolution difference. I already said they're non-uniformly spaced, extremely non-uniformly spaced. So this is a depiction of the resolution projected onto an eye, right? So the resolution is, of course, a spherical function, right? It's an angular function from the center towards the periphery, and you can map that to a sphere, and then you can color code that if you want to see the different resolution. What's kind of interesting is that the area of maximum resolution is extremely small, right? Those that haven't attended computer graphics, I mentioned it before, but if you haven't attended computer graphics, that might be something new. So your area of maximum resolution is about as large as your thumbnail at arm's length. So it's very small. So if you extend your arm, look at your thumb, then all you can see at your maximum resolution is about your thumbnail. Anything off that thumbnail is perceived, or at least detected, at significantly lower resolution. Spatial resolution as well as color resolution. And that's where it becomes interesting for HDR. So here's an image. So if I look on that, look at that butterfly here, I get the butterfly at pretty high resolution. Let's assume here in this case, I'm obviously pretty close to the image because that is way smaller than my thumbnail. But if I'm very close to this image, so that's the butterfly, right? So now if I would shift my vision towards the left, right, and look at the other flower, I can see the bee now, which wasn't visible before. And that is, that's what happens. Why don't we notice this, right? Why don't we realize that this butterfly, when we look at this butterfly, that there's no bee there, or the other way around? Why don't we, all the time, when we look around, see a giant blur and then something at high resolution in the center? And that's basically due to the rest of our visual system assisting us in creating a consistent image of the reality around us. Okay, so vision isn't just the eyes. It's the whole brain that processes this input, right? And the brain is not just doing this kind of lookup table thing to figure out colors. It also combines images that we've seen before, right? Your eyes constantly move around in quick succession and somewhat slower succession. So there are multiple different things that your eyes do. And you also tilt your head. You move your eyes voluntarily on top of the involuntary motion. And all of that creates a set of images that then are combined into what you think you see, which is not what you do. There's easy ways to test that. So what you see here is a foveated image. So that's simply an aerial photograph. And what we did here was we used an eye tracker. That's a simple piece of hardware that tracks your viewing direction. It's basically just a few infrared lights plus an infrared camera that figures out, okay, which eye focuses what point, which is normally the same point. And what happens here is that whoever use that device here focus about here at that point. So here is here the photograph is displayed at highest resolution, and at the left, for instance, you see that it's at lower resolution and at not only at lower spatial resolution, but also at lower color resolution. Okay? So what I'll now do is I'll just turn on a movie where you can see what happens if we actually enable the eye tracking system and follow the gaze of the person. So what you can see here is that this kind of quickly flips back and forth. All right, you see some parts are more black and white, some parts are actually colored. You might even see the resolution change. Okay, so what's curious about this is that whoever is being tracked by the system is unaware of that. So you wouldn't notice that there's color shifts and all of this going on because the system specifically adjusts to your gaze. Okay, so that's an easy way to show that this concept is real, and you're really just thinking. You see everything in color and in high resolution. Yeah, I'm transparent. That's my hobby kind of thing, being transparent, not being in the way. So now that we got a few things explained about, in particular, shortcomings of the human visual systems, which are always a nice thing. So whenever the human visual system falls short, we can probably take advantage of that and also cheat. And here's an explanation for for that shortcoming. Right? So, for instance, I explained that we don't have receptors. We don't have short wavelength receptors in the central area of our retina. And why is that the case? Because, well, it doesn't make sense unless you spend a lot of effort in getting a lens right to focus all different wavelengths at approximately the same point in space. So if you just take a single lens, which is pretty much what our eyes are equipped with, you get an effect that's called chromatic aberration. So if you design a camera, if you have a simple camera, you will see this chromatic aberration issue. And what this means is that different colors, different wavelength of light are focused at different points. And that leads to the fact that if you place your imaging plane somewhere, for instance, red, green, and blue, but any other color as well, images will be slightly shifted. So some are in focus here, some are in focus there, and so on and so forth. To counter that, we can build what's called a chromatic doublet. So you basically combine different types of lenses, different types of glass in a way that you can compensate for this, right? So you still get a focus effect. And the more of these things you stack on top of each other, the better you're able to counter this effect. It never really goes away entirely, but you can counter this pretty decently. And then what digital cameras do on top of that, they add software processing, right? So they know the characteristics of the lens system that is hooked up to the camera, and then they compensate by shifting red, green, and blue images against each other, such that this becomes almost invisible. Right? If you know what you have to look for, you can still see chromatic aberration in photographs. But the point is, we can try to fix this with a lot of technology, with a lot of different materials, but nature decided, okay, whatever, will not fix it and will simply not detect blue light or short light that well in that area. Why? And here's my guess, because in nature there isn't really inherently there aren't so many blue things around, right? We've got a lot of green things around, right? So in particular, kind of Stone Age and before that time, so everything was pretty green, so it kind of makes sense to focus on green. And to distinguish other objects, such as red objects, from green, I don't know, maybe fire, whatever, but to distinguish something. But blue is a pretty unnatural color, except for the sky. But that's pretty much it. Other than that, there's hardly any blue in nature. So that's my guess why nature decided to ignore the blue part, right? It's kind of just an optimization process. Okay, so in summary, what this means is that with our technologically advanced lens systems, we can beat the human visual system easily. Okay, so lenses can easily beat the human visual system, both in focus possibilities, right? Think about telephoto lenses or macro lenses, but also as well as color focus ability. So that beats it. Okay, let's look at the next part of the acquisition process. Let's see how well do chips, computer chips, CCD or CMOS chips, how well do they compare against our retina capabilities? Why do I compare retina? Why do I compare nature to engineering here? Because I want to know how good are we with engineering? We don't have to be better than nature. I mean, it's kind of nice to be better for specific purposes. I don't know, night vision or whatever, telephoto. But for general photography, general cinematography, it's fine. If we are as good as the human visual system, it's okay because, well, we can't perceive anything beyond that anyhow. Okay, so this is why this comparison is important. So if we take a CMOS chip from a couple of years ago, you can see that they are available at bit rates of 14 bits, which gives you a dynamic range of about 16,000 to 1. And how well do our eyes perform? Well, they're around, so under normal circumstances, they're around 1 to 10,000. Okay, so there's situations, in particular nighttime situations, when our eyes had about 45 minutes to an hour to adjust to dark vision. We can crank this up to crazy levels, but under like everyday conditions, I guess we could say that sensors are fine. So we're good to go here, technologically wise. We can make this work. And notice that our nighttime vision is then only rod based, so it's not color anyhow, and well, whatever. So let's just say, okay, we've got that part covered with technologies, and modern sensors even get higher bit rates, so they can capture more dynamic range. And there's some interesting tricks that are also employed to use CMOS and CCD sensors in particular, even with lower technical capabilities, just to still read out some HDR data. It's like overflow counting, and they're interesting things. So, but there's one thing that beats technology, and that's kind of this entire visual cortex that's hooked up to your eyes, right? Just comparing the lens, just comparing the retina, really doesn't do the human visual system justice, because there's a ton of processing going on, right? And it's easy to see, right? I mean, just if you look at images such as this one or this one, like all these optical illusions, so you can see that there's apparently some weird stuff going on, right? While optical illusions are specifically designed in a way that they trick this whole system into situations where it fails, it still shows you that there's a ton of things going on. So, and we've got to mimic that somehow in software to achieve similar results. Okay. So now let's talk about storage. Okay, so we say, okay, well, we can capture the whole stuff. Okay, so we can capture with our high dynamic range camera, and we've got this cool lens which goes beyond human capabilities. Certainly, we can render at way higher precision, right? We use double precision for rendering, so we're also good to go. And then even the 1 million to 1 ratio isn't a big deal. So next thing we need to do is we need to store images. And again, in computer graphics, I talk a lot about color spaces, so I'm not going to repeat this here all, but let's just say a very popular color space is the red, green, and blue. Red, well, running out of arm here. Red, green, and blue. You know what red, green, and blue is, right? So combined with what's called additive mixing, so when you add colors, it gets brighter. Notice that there's other situations, such as a printer, where when you add color, it gets darker, which is because you don't really add color, but you add paint, and here you add light. Okay. Nonetheless, so let's just stick with RGB here, red, green, and blue color space, and not discuss the pros and cons and reasons for having other color spaces. Okay. What's interesting is red, green, and blue are three separate colors, three only. However, we do have a ton of more colors, right? How do we get to the others on top of the three? Well, we can mix those, right? And here's a little bit of mixing, right? If I mix red, green, and blue, I see white. If I mix red and green, I get yellow, for instance. Also, quick notice here, that of course is utter nonsense, okay? So if I mix red and green, what I get is not yellow. No way. I mean, if you look at the frequency distribution, right? What is yellow? Well, yellow is a frequency that's about here. So when I would look at the intensity, it would say, well, no blue, no green, no red light, a lot of yellow light, no, so on and so forth, right? So my energy would look something like this. Okay. Now, red plus green would look something like peak here, nothing here, peak here, which is completely different. Okay. So red and green do not result in yellow, but red and green on our retina tricks our system, our visual system here, into thinking, oh, this could be yellow. The reason for that, I've already explained, is that there's this lookup table thing happening in the brain, right? It says, okay, well, we got 50% long range, we got, I don't know, 10% medium range, and we got so many percent short range, and then we look this up. So now if we have multiple impulses here, the brain isn't, or none of the hardware is capable of detecting the difference between one pulse and two pulses. All we can read out of the sensors is how do these three receptors respond? And they happen to respond in the same way when we see yellow light, as well as when we see superposition of green and red light. Red and green light, okay? So it's not the same, it just looks the same because our detection hardware is incapable of detecting the difference. Okay, so if we would have more receptors, we would easily, well, not easily, but we would potentially detect the difference, and monitors wouldn't work the way they do. It's kind of an interesting thing. So this idea of having three impulses is based on the fact that we have three detectors. So if we choose those three impulses in a clever way, we can pretty much cover all of the perceivable colors. Another side note, again, more than in computer graphics, red, green, and blue, their superposition is not sufficient to cover all of the perceivable colors. Okay, so it doesn't work out 100%. It works out pretty well, but not 100%. Okay, so there's some colors that exist that we cannot create with the red, green, and blue. So, and here is a depiction of that. So what you see here is the color gamut, or is a cross section through the color gamut, to be precise. So that's a visualization of all the perceivable colors of a certain brightness level. And it's just a visualization. Those aren't the actual colors because I show that on a monitor. And it's again reproduced through a computer system. And what you get with red, green, and blue is one of those triangles. So if you take any of those triangles, say I take the RGB LED triangle, which is the biggest one here in white, then the superposition of any of those colors is a linear combination of the three values, of the green value here, the blue value here, and the red one. So I can cover that interior, but this entire part is missing, or as well as this one here. So I can't recreate that with that specific light source. Okay, so it doesn't work out very well. And as you can see, the overall shape is not a triangle. Okay, so whatever I choose, those three corner points of the triangles, I'll never be able to cover this entire thing. And there's interesting ways how to detect this. Again, more on that in computer graphics. There's different color spaces. You can use CMYK, XYZ, HSV, HSL, whatever. You can convert one into the other, but that's again not the key thing. The key thing here for computer graphics HDR is quantization. Okay, so whatever we choose, RGB, CMY, CMYK, XYZ, HSV, HSL, whatever we choose, we store 3 components. Well, except for CMYK, which stores 4. But all the others store 3 components, and they need to be, well, stored. So when we store them, we generally decide how to do this. So we say it's 8-bit, right? It's just a byte. Or we say, well, it's a 16-bit value or it's a 32-bit floating point value. But we make some decision here, okay? And that decision is made one and for all, right? So we say, okay, well, that data is stored in 8-bit, and then it's 8-bit, usually red, green, and blue, so a total of 24 bits. And that implies a quantization. If I use 8-bit per color, which is the usual way to go, I have 256 distinct values that I can represent. Okay? I can represent 256 shades of blue, of red, and green if I choose RGB, which in total gives me about 16 million possible combinations. Okay, 24 bits, 2 to the 24th power is roughly 16 million. So sounds like a lot, but here's the thing. If we just look at the brightness values, okay, how many different brightness values can we achieve? Well, let's say, okay, we can crank everything down to 0. We can crank everything up to 1. So the steps that we make are, well, in 8-bit. So we're always doing a step that is 1/256th, I guess, right? So our quantization steps are actually pretty large. So we only have a dynamic range from 1 to 256 if we do it this way. Okay, so well, and we can scale this all up, right? We can multiply our brightness values in total by, I don't know, 1 million, but then still we go from 1 million to 256 million, which if we factor this out, is still 1 to 256. So there's no trouble with just using straightforward 8-bit formats. Okay, so how can we fix it? What does an HDR format look like? And here are a couple of examples of HDR format. And the simple thing is just use more bits. I guess that's pretty much what it boils down to, right? So, and here's a couple of somewhat popular formats. The thing is, you don't want to just say, okay, well, okay, you could do this approach, like I don't care about storage, like I just use double precision for red, green, and blue, right? It's 64 bits per channel, good to go. Certainly true, but that would create gigantic images, right? I mean, they grow significantly, and in particular, movies, like sequences of images, which is where the name moving images comes from, right? Sequences of images would blow up in size significantly, and also the processing time would grow significantly. So we should use as few bits as necessary to, again, beat the human visual system. We don't need to get beyond that. It's fine. If we can beat the visual system, human visual system, fine. Or if we beat the reproduction system, okay, say the reproduction system, TV, projector in the movie theater, whatever, is worse than the human visual system, which it generally is. When was the last time you were blinded by your TV not getting up from sleep, right? Under normal illumination situations, you're not blinded by the TV. It's not like there's parts of the TV that are so bright that they would blind you. But if you walk outside, even on a somewhat cloudy day, you're easily blinded by the sun, right? So, of course, the illumination values that a TV, even an HDR TV can create are way worse than nature or what we can perceive. That said, our imaging format in the limit should be as good as the human visual system, but in the meantime, it's fine enough if it's good enough for the reproduction device. So again, here are a couple of different popular formats. So you can use 11 bits, for instance, in what's called log exponential encoding. So instead of using 8-bit, just use 3 more bits. But instead of encoding uniform steps, this format encodes logarithmic, or depends on how you see it, exponential steps. So the first couple of steps are smaller than the latter ones. So you have less resolution for bright values, but you have a significantly bigger dynamic range. Okay, you can also use a format that uses on top of red, green, blue, uses another value as an exponent. So just that's sort of similar to the idea of floating point, mantissa plus exponent to get a dynamic range, right? So you store in regular RGB your base plus some exponent to kind of get a larger dynamic range. It's just another 8-bit. And then let's just move on to the last one here, because that's kind of the most popular one. Or you say, well, okay, well, say these days we have enough storage and capabilities, so we'll just store everything in floating point, but not 32-bit. That's really overkill, 16-bit. And the latter one is really a very popular format these days. So the former ones, they're kind of, they save more memory, but with growing computing and storage capabilities, OpenEXR, which is just a fancy name for saying store red, green, blue in just 16-bit half precision floating point values. That's a very popular approach. Is there a popular 10-bit system for working out videos and photos supported by support? I don't know about any of the storage formats for that data. So what you often see is that the data is stored in, again, either half or a floating point precision, and they're then converted for processing on the screen. In particular, since in many cases, processing floating point is faster than processing some special format, even though there are some instruction to do this, right? But the computation and also the storage usually happens in floating point or in single precision floating point to be precise, or in half precision floating point. I've never seen a system do it in double, for instance. I don't think that there's no reason whatsoever to do this. But where did the 10 bits come from? I mean, it's a good point that you raised this. Where did this 10-bit thing come from? Well, it comes from, again, the reproduction devices, right? Monitors that you would say, okay, well, we've got our LEDs, for instance, or our LCD, whatever the illumination or the recreation source is, whether it's organic LED or LCD, set up in a way that we can get 10 bits of instead of 8-bit precision. However, there's a catch to that, and that is, what exactly is HDR? So there's no trademark on HDR. Okay. So at least not that I'm aware. So everyone can call their systems HDR. Right? I mean, there's things like Dolby Vision or whatever, right? So there's specific trademarks, but the bottom line is HDR is nothing that is inherently protected by any governing body. So if you say, okay, this monitor does 10 bits of precision, I mean, it's good. It gives you smaller steps. It gives you smaller steps in between the colors. But technically, this doesn't really tell you much about HDR. It tells you a little bit about, you get a higher HDR because your first step is now smaller, right? So your minimum color compared to the maximum color, which is the high dynamic range definition, is different, is bigger, right? Because your first step is small. This is also why you have a log exponential encoding here, right? So your first steps, or your first couple of steps, they should be small so you can represent dark colors that are different from complete black. Okay. Now, but here's the thing: what this doesn't tell you is really, it doesn't tell you like how bright can your monitor get, how bright can your device really get, which is another important thing, right? You can increase the dynamic range by being able to handle really dark colors very well. But what you want in the end is this plus the ability to display very bright colors very well as well. So it's kind of hard to say how much that really helps you. What 10-bit monitors are really good for, and that's an important thing, is if you work with grayscale data. So for instance, if you work at a hospital with CT and MR data, which is usually displayed in grayscale, just in black and white. Also, good reasons for not using color maps, different story. But let's just say they use black and white. Since that's the case, that you use black and white, you also want to have very nice quantization, rather small quantization, so you get all the data. Because the output of scanners is generally 11 or 12 bits in black and white or shades of gray. Okay, so this is where these things shine. And if you have more bits in the representation, but not higher, not significantly higher values, technically, yes, it's a higher dynamic range. Practically, it doesn't make a big difference. Okay, so you also want very high brightness values and not just distinguishable low brightness values. Or technically, you would want both. Okay, so that's the thing. So anyways, let's keep things short here. 12-bit floating, 60-bit floating point, and you're good to go. Okay, so now we can store this stuff. So how do we record the data? I said there are some sensors around. There are these cool lenses around. Yes, and you can use them. So you can buy an HDR camera, like an actual camera that records HDR right off the sensor, right? That's capable of dealing with very bright light while simultaneously dealing with low light in a way that the low light results in something other than zero and the bright light results in something other than oversaturated sensors. So the sensor just, I mean, it needs more capacity, so to say, right? I mean, if you look at how these sensors work, there's usually some sort of a capacitor that charges with electrons, and it just needs to be able to hold a lot of charge. It needs to be able to also read out at fine detail. Okay, so these things exist, but they're really expensive. Okay, so often that is not the method of choice. What you can do is you can do multiple exposures, and that's what pretty much all of the HDR devices do, right? If you buy a cell phone, which is the #1 camera around, right? I mean, most people take their photographs with cell phones these days, and pretty much all of them have HDR capabilities. And what they do is they take multiple exposures and then cleverly combine them into a single image. But what do you do if the scene changes? Because the drawback is that one of your exposures has to be a very long exposure here, the brighter one, right? It has to be pretty long so that even if there's situations where there's very little light, our somewhat inferior or normal sensor needs to accumulate a lot of the photons before it actually can tell a difference. So, and that long exposure, well, long exposures cause trouble, right? If the scene is in motion, a long exposure causes blurriness. So that's obviously an issue with those sensors, and that's prohibited for certain movie applications, right? If you just want to take a photograph, okay, you can say, well, hold still. If you do a movie, then hold still is not an option, right? So for that, you can still do multiple exposures, but they have to be, the difference has to be very small, right? The longest exposure still has to be a relatively short exposure. So, but how do you merge this? Assuming that we can live with that, the idea is relatively straightforward, right? The idea is we live under this assumption that the world doesn't change, right? I mean, we assume that from the short exposure to the long exposure, nothing has changed. If that assumption is violated, we get a wrong result. We call this blurriness or whatever. Okay, so and that said, then look at the sequence here of images. So all of those images actually should, if the image hasn't changed, if the world hasn't changed, they should contain the same data, right? I mean, it's the same scene that I see, so they are the same. They are different representations of the same data. Okay, so what this means is that here in this image, I get all zeros here. Okay, and in that image here at the outside, I get, well, non-zero values. If the scene hasn't changed, then I could combine these. And what is different in those images? Well, this here is a longer exposure. The one on the left is a shorter exposure. So all that happened here is that whatever came in terms of photon energy from the world is just multiplied by a certain factor, right? If I take a 10 times longer exposure, I would expect 10 times as many photons. Okay, so what happened here, there were regions where the number of photons here are below a certain threshold, so the sensor doesn't detect them. Okay, so it assigns 0. On the right, they are way above that threshold, so we can actually distinguish them. Now, if I would take all of these images, which are stored in 8-bit or whatever the camera does, and convert them to a floating point. Okay, so I just store, if this value here is 20, 20 in 8-bit. I now just store it as 20 in floating point. So no change, right? I just waste a little bit of space. Now, the next thing I can do is I can take this image here, now that it's in high precision, and the image and any of the other image, and divide by the exposure time to keep things simple. So generally you have an exposure curve, but let's just assume everything is linear, right? Then I would just divide this here by, say, this is 10 times the exposure. So if I divide this by 10, I would expect both of these images to be exactly the same, right? Because that now is divided by 10 and this was kept as it is. So all of those values should be exactly the same. And where they disagree, this is where one is, well, more accurate than the other. And what we can simply do is we can simply use values that are 0, but here are, well, now they're maybe also smaller than 1, but they are not 0, but they're 1.2 or 1.3 or 1.4. So we'll simply use the small values from here. And now large values that were here set to 1, which if I divide them by, say, 10, are 1/10, I would use the small values here, okay, because they're now sort of also in that range. They are beyond this 1/10, right? But those were overexposed, so the capacitor was at its full charge. It couldn't accept, or it didn't accept any further charge from the photons. And if we combine this, we get one single image, and we can do this with multiple exposures as well, but just by first aligning them or calibrating them to the same setup so that we get one consistent image with their exposure times. And that's what you kind of see here at the bottom. Okay, so the only difference is that it's not just a division by 10, it's a more complicated step, which involves some characteristics of the lens, of the CCD and all of that. But effectively, it's just taking all of those things and applying a normalization step, and it could be division by 10 in my example, or a more complicated function that is tied to the specific sensor, right? Because none of these sensors really work linear, right? They charge and discharge differently in different ranges. But these curves that you see here are curves that are dependent on the hardware, right? And notice here, these days we would kind of take this way. This straight path is for analog photography, which still exists, right? If you want to combine analog photos, remember that one photograph from 1856, right? In that case, you also have to take in the development cycle and the film characteristics into account. But we don't have this these days. We just have the straightforward sensor. We don't digitize photos, but we use digital data right away. So with that, you get one consistent image you take, and that technically means, this is how it's often explained, that you take one pixel here and you take another pixel from the other side. But what you really do is you kind of first overlap all of the images into a common space, and then you check, okay, well, this is all mapped to 0, and that was all mapped to saturated. And then you kind of get one consistent image up, which is then still in floating point precision, right? It's not floating point precision, and we need to somehow output that, okay? So next step, next question is, how do we take that data that was either rendered or photographed with that expensive camera or acquired through a sequence of images that were cleverly combined into a single image, into a single high precision, say, ILM OpenEXR image with 16-bit floating point per channel? And again, there's a simple choice, and that is buy a freaking expensive HDR device. And I'm not talking about go to your next electronics store, spend 10,000 bucks on a cool monitor. I mean, go to a special store, spend 2 million bucks on a special monitor. That's the type of thing I'm talking about, right? So if you buy these things, yes, you can output HDR content. And there used to be a company called Brightside that a colleague founded in Canada. They were bought a couple of years ago by Dolby, and they would manufacture these monitors. So they would take normal monitors and take the whole backlighting system out and integrate their own system into this very expensive, very bulky. So this is literally what one of those screens look like, right? A gigantic frame around it. So it wasn't really that pleasant, but it created very, very bright areas. And also very dark areas, right? And as you can see here with a tree in front of the sun, so really impressive impressive work, but very expensive, and include a lot of handiwork on top of a lot of software. So while I don't think any of the hardware really made it to Dolby, but they used a lot of the software and algorithm technologies, which then I suppose, I mean, you never know because they won't tell you, but I suppose all this Dolby Vision stuff kind of originates from Brightside's technology. So that is out of the question for most folks. A, because it's very expensive, and B, Brightside doesn't exist anymore. So I'm pretty sure you'll find another company that manufactures something for you for a few $1,000,000, but that's probably not the route to go. So what can we do? And so we need to somehow work with low dynamic range, or as it's more politically correct, standard dynamic range, okay, which is really low dynamic range. But anyways, SDR. So we've got SDR monitors, or we got what MediaMarkt calls HDR, or what Panasonic, whatever, calls HDR, which is SDR plus a little bit stuff. So we've got to process our real HDR data too, so that you can view it. And this process again is called tone mapping. So tone mapping is an overview. So here you see an image on the left, which is just, if you would straightforward take an HDR image and would display it, or you would just take an SDR image from a camera and would display it, compared to something that has been processed in HDR with, say, 16-bit floating point precision, and then properly handcrafted, so to say, or algorithmically crafted in a way that you get all the details. Okay, so here you see all the details. Again, it's this hello world scenario, right? Bright sunlight outside, relatively dark inside. And that's obviously a cathedral here. And a cathedral is particularly interesting because it's got stained glass, right? So you, under normal SDR conditions, all of the stained glass with bright sunlight is gone. It's just bright. Whereas if you properly process it, you can still see the pictures in the glass or at the top, right? So how can we achieve that? And well, first of all, what do we want to achieve? Well, and there's actually not entirely clear. So you might want to shoot for something artistic, as I had some images at the very beginning of the stream today, right? Artistic images that certainly don't look like reality, but what we certainly want is we want visibility to be reproduced, okay? Something that we could, a difference that was perceivable before should be perceived, okay? And then in general, in most cases, you have this requirement or this kind of idea that the viewing the image should produce the same experience or sensation as viewing the real thing, okay? Which is obviously ill-posed because your monitor is not capable of displaying the real thing. But we want to somehow make it feel as if, okay? It's just like, it's similar to audio, right? You have like spatial audio, right? I mean, you experience spatial audio when you walk through the world, and you want your stereo to recreate with just two speakers, something that sort of feels spatially, right? And you can do something that's called computational audio to get that to work. And here you can use something that is generally referred to as computational. Well, photography is one thing, but that does a lot of things more. But tone mapping, let's say tone mapping to achieve this. Okay, let's see what we've got. Let's take our hello world example again, indoor scene, bright window. Okay, and what I can do is to just get more data displayed is I can use a color map, and I just want to use luminance here. So I'm only interested in brightness, right? And that's what you really care mostly in HDR, right? You can separate brightness from color information relatively easily, and then deal with the brightness and add color later. So now if I take that typical hello world scene, right, outside window, inside, and just take the brightness value, right, it's pretty bright outside, relatively dark inside. I can color code that. So I can use all my 16, so if I have 3 times 8-bit, I can use my 16 million colors and somehow arrange them in a rainbow or something. And suddenly I have 16 million distinguishable states. I have 24 bits at hand. And I can use this. I can use this to map the different luminance values to colors. And that doesn't really look too realistic. None at all, unless you've taken some drug or I don't know what. Right? But nonetheless, I get a high level of distinguishability, right? I've got the outside, which is extremely bright, mapped to my red colors here. that is distinguishable from the inside. So I can kind of see both things. First of all, I can see it's way brighter outside than it is inside by looking at the color map. And I can see there's structure outside and there's structure inside. So you could say it kind of works, but that doesn't recreate the same experience. So however we judge this statement of recreating the same experience, it certainly falls short of pretty much any definition, I would say. So let's try other things. Let's try linear mapping. Let's take the brightest value and map that to 1. And let's take the darkest value and map that to 0. And any values in between, map them linearly. What we get is the image on the right. So it's pretty dark inside and it's relatively bright outside. So, doesn't work out very well. So we can also use the linear mapping in a slightly different fashion by, for instance, ignoring the light source values, okay? And just saying, well, we'll map anything except the light source or anything that's close to the light source linearly, then we get everything right except something that's close to the light source, which is all white. So not really brilliant either. So what else can we do? Well, we can tone map the thing. Again, so I think I said this a couple of times. So, and I also mentioned a few times, well, tone mapping is really a class of approaches. Okay, and I just want to talk about a few very simple approaches. If you want to know more, just look for tone mapping literature. You'll find books about that big. And as I said, there's 200 methods or 10,000 methods around, and one is better than all of the others. At least that's the claim. But there's some easy ways to achieve a situation such as this one here. Okay, so first of all, let's again look at the epic fails. Okay, setting the brightest value to 1, scaling the rest linear, not a good idea. Okay, why? Because you got these bright values there, like 10 million before I rescale them, and you got the dark ones somewhere between 1 and 20, right? Like if I divide everything by 1 million, then the dark ones between 1 and 20, they're all mapped to 1 or 0. Okay, so this is why that doesn't work, and more mathematically speaking, it's because the light sources are orders of magnitude brighter than anything else. Okay, so, okay, well, if the bright sources cause such a big deal, then let's just ignore them. Okay, so we'll just say, okay, well, there's the bright sources, there's the light sources which are bright. Okay, and we'll just ignore them. Okay, so we'll just start at not the brightest pixels, but maybe ignore the, I don't know, 10% brightest, okay, and map those to the 1 minus epsilon, so the next color to 1. So anything above that, even though it might be significantly bigger, let's make that 1. And then anything that's not a light source, we'll make that 1 minus epsilon. So for instance, in 8-bit, that would be 245, whereas the other one would 255. And then map everything else linearly, okay, or logarithmically, whatever you choose. Okay, so what's the problem? Your light sources are still saturated to 1, okay? And anything between your 1 minus epsilon, so your 200, which is mapped to 254 and 255, anything in between that is still all 1, right? It's still all overexposed. Okay, so, but that has already advantage that it generally preserves the visibility much better because you don't tend to look into the light source, and that's a good thing. Don't look into the sun. Okay, so it's a pretty good idea, but the experience is different. Okay, so it's not this kind of a blinding experience that you would expect. Okay, and another bad thing about this is since it's normalized, regardless of how bright your scene is, it always looks the same, right? If you have one scene and you change the brightness, so for instance, you have a change over day, right, from night to day, your scene will look exactly the same regardless of what daytime you are in, okay? Which is another significant disadvantage. So you don't want dark scenes to occupy necessarily the entire range of values, right, regardless of what your TV can do. So there's a couple of issues here. So what can we do about this? So yeah, let's look at a simple tone mapping approach here that converts something like this here to something like that here. So again, scenes such as this one or such as the this Hello World Windows scenario. How do we do this? And I'll simply use techniques that maybe some of you have heard before if you attended some of my other lectures. So if this here's the histogram, that's the brightness distribution. Okay, the first thing we can do is we can do a histogram equalization, right? I talked about this a couple of times. Just funny enough, which is I think the first time that this happened. Funny enough, I just talked about this week, as a matter of fact, yesterday in visualization. So if you attend a visualization, that's exactly the same histogram equalization idea here. Okay, so the first thing we do is we take the brightness value in floating point, right, in their full beauty, and we'll equalize them over the entire range. Okay, so because they might not spread off over the entire range. How does histogram equalization work? Okay, regardless of HDR or non-HDR, it works for pretty much any content. Let's look at what a histogram is first. A histogram here, and again, if you intended visualization, this is familiar to you, hopefully. What's a histogram? Here you can see the histogram for that image. There's the red thing here, and here you see this red graph, which is a histogram for this image here. It's the same. It's not the same image. It's the same scene. Okay, it just has a slightly different histogram. So what a histogram is, it's really it's counting how many pixels of a certain, in this case, luminance of a certain brightness do we have. So what this here means, so this is a bar chart really. I mean, those are pretty small bars. Here you can see them better. But this is just a bar chart, right? This is the typical bar chart with just very tiny bars. So what we see here is brightness values at the bottom. So from 0 to 256 in this case. So it's apparently 8-bit brightness. So we have no pixels that are pitch black, no pixels that have a brightness of 0, which is okay. I mean, you see, there's no black pixels in here. There's no pixels with value 1, 2, 3, 4, 20, and so on. So all of those are non-existent, so we don't see anything. And here we have, I don't know, 5 pixels of that brightness, 10 pixels of that, 100 pixels of that brightness, 5,000 and a million of that brightness or so. And then it decreases here. So at some point we also run out of pixels. So there's no white ones in here. So that's what a histogram is. And again, here's also a histogram. It's just for that image here. And you see there's a lot of dark pixels in there, right? I mean, you see there's black ones in there. And there's also a lot of white ones in there. And also the in-betweens exist. Some don't, but we've got some all over the place. So that's first of all what a histogram is. So it tells you how often does each color show up or each brightness show up. Okay, so that's the first function. Now there's another function in here, that's this black one, and that's the CDF, the cumulative density function. Okay, what's that? It's a pretty simple thing. For the mathematically inclined, it's simply the integral over the red function, or if you want it more normal human-like, the black function is from left to right at each point counting how many red values we had towards the left. So what does that mean? It means if you look at the black function here, let's start here first, okay? So the black function, it's kind of hard to see here because it coincides with this axis. It starts here, then goes up, and then continues here. Okay, so that's the black function. It always ends at 1 or at 100%, and it always starts at 0, okay? So what it does again, it tells us if I look at this function at some point, it tells me, because it starts at 0 and it ends at 1, the percentage, if I multiply it by 100, the percentage, how many values did I see so far? So here, for instance, it's 0 because none of the red values I've seen so far. Okay, here it is at 0.5. So that means at this point here, that's roughly the point, right? I have the same amount of reds on the left and on the right, right? And here the function is at maybe 0.9, so 90%. So at this point, I've already seen 90% of the red values. Okay, so it's simply the integral over the red curve, right? Or it's the sum of all the red bars towards the left. Okay, so that's the CDF. So as you see here, the CDF has this S shape, and that's normal because it starts at 0, ends at 1. It normally has got an S shape. Here, the CDF is pretty much a straight line, except for a little bit of a staircasing. But ignoring that, it's a straight line. And that's a good CDF in terms of using the data space, and the other one's bad. Why is this one good? What does it mean for a line to be straight? If the line would be perfectly straight without the staircases here, what that means is that after 50% of the values, 50% of the range, I've seen 50% of the values. After 80% of the range, I've seen 80% of the values. After 10% of the range, I've seen 10% of the values. What this means is the values are uniformly distributed over my entire range, which means, well, they're good to go, right? So we make perfect use of the entire range of values. That's what this CDF is. Yeah, it's cool. Thank you. It's like, yeah, you can ask a question if you want to. So what this tells you is this is the CDF that we want when we want to use the entire range of values in optimum fashion. Now, what we want is for an image to kind of go from here to here to make this optimum use. Now, there's an issue, right? I mean, how do I achieve a straight CDF? It's pretty simple. If I have 1,000 values and I have, say, 100 different shades of gray, just assign 10 values to each shade of gray. I mean, that's pretty much it, right? 1,000 values. If I throw them at 100 buckets, I just need 10 values each bucket, and I've got my straight CDF. The trouble is, I can't do it. I can't break this. Any of those bars up, because what does a bar say? Well, a bar says, well, if this bar here is, for instance, I don't know, 20, it says 20 pixels have that brightness. And I can't just randomly take 10 of those pixels and assign one brightness to them, and 10 of those pixels and assign another brightness to them, because they're supposed to have that particular brightness, right? So all I can do is I can shift the bars, right? I can't change any of the bars, but I can shift them around. I can say, well, all of these pixels that have this grayscale value, give them another grayscale values, but I can only do this to all of them simultaneously. So what I want to do is I want to take this thing here and spread it out, right? So that it covers the entire range and gives me an approximately straight line. Okay, now the question is, how do I do this? And the process is really that simple. If I take this function here, all I have to do is, first of all, shift it to the left. Running out of arm here. Shift it to the left. So I take this thing here and shift it here. So what I do is I simply subtract from the brightness value, I subtract this point where the CDF, the black function, first becomes non-zero. Okay, so I simply subtract it, and then all of this sits here. And now I take this red shifted thing and stretch it to the right. So I kind of stretch this apart. And how do I stretch it? Well, every time I have a lot of values, so every time I have a peak, I leave a very relatively long gap, right? Notice here. Because when I've already used a lot of values, I have to leave a longer gap so that, well, say at this point I've used 20% of my values, then I have to wait until I cover 20% of the range before I use the next values. So I simply use the CDF, because it is the sum of all values, to make those jumps. Okay, so in summary, here's the equation for that one, which is probably a little bit more complicated than it looks, to compute this. So I got a question: shouldn't the distribution be a little bit sigmoid for a more natural image to what? Well, I guess again that it's that's a good question. And that boils down to the question, like, what's natural anyhow, right? And on top of this, in particular for, say, more natural viewing experience, you got a lot more going on than just the image, right? You got the gamma calibration, you got your monitor, and all of this is nonlinear. So this is mainly, and I'm not at tone mapping yet, right? So this is just an ingredient for this. But this is mainly taking sort of a information science approach here, or trying to, well, make best use of the range. I'm not necessarily shooting for best perception, right? I mean, and you can actually tell by this image here. Oops, let's go back. I mean, this might not look natural, right? I don't know under which lighting condition the image was taken, but maybe the left one is more natural because it was, I don't know, cloudy day or so. So maybe misty day. So I'm not at this point trying to make this look natural. I'm just trying to make best use of my range of values here. Okay. So, but yeah, you're right. So you probably want to have something different when you want to use those values directly. Well, let's just take a quick look at this correction function here. So what you see here is the histogram equalization, and what it does is it takes input values, okay, V. So that's my input brightness, and you simply run this over all pixels. Takes input brightness and outputs H of B, so the corrected brightness. So how is that computed? And it's pretty much computed. Ignore this here for a second. That's times L minus 1. Okay, so I'll explain that in a second. Just ignore that. So what we do is we first subtract CDF min. Okay, what is CDF min? That's the point where the minimum point where CDF is non-zero, which is exactly what I said. Like this is this point here, and that's what we subtract. So we shift it to the left. Okay, so this is the subtraction of the CDF min, and then we simply assign as position CDF of the value divided by width times height. What is width times height? That is simply the number of pixels in an image. Okay, so that's the total number. This is the number if you have a non-normalized CDF that is not between 0 and 1, but the actual pixel count. This is your 1, right? This is what the CDF ends up. This is this value here. Running out of arm. Really need to fix it. This is this value here, right? This is width times height, because that's the number of pixels. This is 0, okay? So if you divide by width times height, you get this between 0 and 1. That's what this normalization is good for, because the CDF is generally non-normalized. It's really the number of pixels so far, okay? So in this, as I said, you want every bar to be at that point between 0 and 1, where, how should I say that the best, where its position is equal to the percentage of values that you've already seen, right? That was our premise to start with. When I'm here at this point, I want this diagonal CDF because I want, if I'm at 0.5, I want 0.5 of the values to the left. And that's exactly what we do here. So we first subtract this, and then we make sure that our new position, that's our new position, is the cumulative density function at that point divided by the overall pixels. Why do I multiply this with L minus 1, L minus 1 here? Because this value is between 0 and 1, and L is simply your number of values. So that would be 256 shades of gray. Okay, so the L minus 1 is simply to get back to 0 to 255. Okay, so that's what that computation here is good for. So if we run that on an image, you spread out all the values, and that makes best use. Okay, so when we do that to our data, when we do that to our high dynamic range data, now back to HDR, we were at HDR in case you've just tuned in. How does that help us to get HDR to work? Well, it helps us to spread out our data from the very bright ones to the very low ones, so that we use our data range in, say, floating point or whatever our current quantization is, in an optimum fashion. Okay, and now if we quantize that down to, say, 8-bit, we at least have a good chance to capture most of the values properly. But as Smish K Twitch, I think that's how it's pronounced, pointed out, that probably doesn't look very realistic, right? In particular, there's one thing very badly, it doesn't really capture the sensation of those extremely bright spots very well, because we kind of spread this out all the way. Okay, thanks. So, and to recover that, you want to add some effects. So at least if you do one type of tone mapping, again, there's multiple different ways of tone mapping. One way is to just spread out things using histogram equalization, and then later on adding effects to very bright points. Okay, so here's an example for a typical computer game scenario, right? Where you want to convey that this here is super immensely bright. Okay, you want to convey that this part is bright, even though your monitor is not capable of displaying it as it's super bright, because, well, your monitor just isn't that bright. So how do you do this? And you do this by mimicking an effect that appears in particular in lens systems, but also to some degree in our visual system, and that is light blooming or veiling. Okay, what happens here is the following. If a part of your sensor or a part of your retinal sensor, like your biological sensor, receives a lot of light, right? Receives a lot of photonic energy, then some of that energy might spread out into neighboring receptors, right? So for instance, your capacitor will completely charge, will have an effect on neighboring sensors, or your action potential generated by your receptors has an effect on neighboring receptors. But the big deal is, or the big picture is, if you have a lot of energy at some point, it's probably going to spread out. And depending on your lens system that you use, not your visual system, but in particular a lens system that you use in a camera, you can have all kinds of effects, right? So such as lens flares and these kind of things, which happen due to reflections that are normally invisible, but for immensely bright light, create artifacts, okay, which you generally try to avoid. But here we're kind of tuned to using those cues, okay, both for cameras, but even better for our visual system. So our entire human visual system is built that it takes any information that it can into account. And it actually makes use of this oversaturation information. Okay, so if the system realizes, oh, there's a bright spot and then there's other kind of bright spot that have an awkward distribution, such as this one here around, like this situation here, our brain is capable of automatically, for us, figuring out, okay, that's the structure here. Okay, there's the beam here, or I don't know, some it's I don't know, some poster or whatever, right here, and we know that this is here, and we can figure out from past experience it's not bright here. There's no light source here, but this light here apparently affects this one, so it either shines through or it affects our sensors. So, and from that, our visual system infers, okay, well, we're oversaturated here, so let's tell the human this is very bright. And this is something that you can also use when you create renderings. So you can specifically let data values that are very bright, that after your remapping step ended up being bigger than 1 or ended up being very close to 1, right? So light sources are still mapped to 1 if you do this 1 minus epsilon approach after a histogram equalization, right? You can take the original values, check, okay, how much are they bigger than 1, or how much were they bigger than the original maximum intensity, and based on that, add such a blooming effect. And that will have then an effect on our interpretation of the scene. And this can be very powerful, okay? So here's an example of a scene where we take the data like right as it is. So everything is white, doesn't work out very well. So what we want to do is we would rather like to take this scene and remap it, and after that add effects. So, and here's a little bit of a pipeline, and I'll talk about this in a second. And then we can create an image such as this one here. So we mapped everything down, okay? So everything was darkened effectively by doing histogram equalization plus a 1 minus epsilon mapping, and then we specifically add these features here back to the image so that it creates these flares, which are more what you would expect from a lens system rather than from our eyes alone, but we're pretty good at interpreting that as well. So how can that be achieved, in particular in an interactive setting? So those are all screenshots from the DirectX 10, I think, DirectX 10 demo to explain how that works. And here's kind of the recipe, but let me just ignore that for a second and go right to a picture that explains this idea. So what you see at the top are just the very bright values. So that's the very same scene. So this is this scene here, okay? So, but I just look at the very bright spots. So there's a few, like if you look at the image behind me, so there's a few windows like there. So again, Hello World scenario, like dark cave environment, very bright windows. So there's a bunch of windows behind those pillars that where all the light comes from, okay, that are significantly brighter. So if I now just take the highest values, I only see those few bright spots. But now, so this is like the short exposure image in a sense. But now those few bright spots are actually contain a lot of information, namely the light that comes from the outside. So the first thing that I can do is I can just blur that. I can just do a low pass filter and blur the image. Now, blurring an image, applying in particular a big filter is usually a pretty costly operation, right? If you want a big filter that spreads out things significantly, you need to cover maybe, I don't know, 100 by 100 pixels, and then compute your weighted average, like a Gaussian filter or something, okay? Some low pass filter. And that's expensive, 100 times 100 pixels, right? It's 10,000 values in total. If you do this for entire image, you do 10,000 times 10 million computations. Well, that might take a while. To improve the performance in particular, not necessarily the quality, but improve the performance, what you would generally do in a real-time game setup, so this is now a little bit of a hack, but just to let you know how this is achieved, is you downsample the image. You take your whatever 1000 by 1000 image, and you first downsample that to 100 by 100, maybe even 10 by 10. And then you do a very small filter on that image, 3 by 3 filter, right? Now that filter now covers a huge range, right? It's a very low resolution filter because, like, if I downsample that 10 by 10, I only get a total of 100 values, but I can still sample those up again and add it to the image. So that's kind of a quick hack of getting a filter with a big exposure at the cost of resolution. But since we're shooting for a low pass filter anyhow, which is supposed to suppress small frequency, high frequencies. Oh, I know, which is supposed to suppress high frequencies, that doesn't really hurt too much. Okay, so that's how you achieve that blooming effect. And if you want, on top of that, if you want those flares, you kind of do the same, except that after downsampling, your filter is anisotropic. So it's basically an elongated filter into a particular direction, and you can rotate that into various directions. And this rotation can be computed from camera to light alignment if you want to. And then you add this to your image and you get your blooming and veiling effect. How is the top right image produced technically? The top right, I thought that was like this one here. That is produced by taking this image here, or taking the original image, taking just the values, like anything that's above 100 in floating point, right? I'm talking still about the full precision image, right? And downsampling that. Take the big image, downsample that, take your whatever 4K image, downsample that to just 100 by 50. In that 100 by 50 image, you do a Gaussian filter. You do a Gaussian blur filter, 5 by 5 filter. Okay, so and you can apply that filter multiple times, right? So this is applying it once, this is applying it a second time. And then you get a fairly low resolution image, 100 by 50 in my example, that is blurred. Okay, now you take that image and again stretch it to the entire 4K image, so you upsample that and you get your final result. And then this is what you get if you use anisotropic filters. Okay, so you could do like this full blurring in the full resolution right away, but this is much faster, right? Downsampling first, filtering, upsampling is much faster than doing this gigantic filter in your original image. Okay, so if you add all of that back together, you get the image that I just said, and that's sort of standard now in computer games. And then this entire pipeline, right? Running the computer game with higher precision, maybe 10 bits, 20 bits, whatever bits you like. Again, 16 bits per channel is generally sufficient. Then doing histogram equalization on the image, doing a 1 minus epsilon remapping, and then adding blooming and veiling filters. That's kind of one of the very standard parts that you can get in kind of out of the box in engines these days. What other tone mapping techniques exist? Well, if you want to have more sophisticated tone mapping, you look at local operators. So, for instance, instead of trying to optimize the entire picture to find kind of a global mapping of how can I map one brightness to another brightness, you rather look at the gradients. Okay, you look, okay, in the high dynamic range image, how much do 2 points differ? Okay, so do they differ by something that I can perceive? Then I want to remap that local neighborhood to values that also differ by something that I can still perceive, but in the low dynamic range. Okay, so more sophisticated tone mapping filters look at local properties. So they are greedy. For instance, they grow one region until they reach a property, grow another one, and then they resemble those or start in some random fashion. But they tend to look at higher order properties such as the first or second derivative. It's certainly not about COVID as far as I'm aware, unless that has anything to do with high dynamic range imaging. Okay, so that said, do we have any questions regarding high dynamic range imaging, or HDRI in short? Ah, okay, here I see it. Yeah, it's the Center of Visual Data Analysis and Computer Graphics. And I picked that name it's about a decade ago. So uh, I didn't see that connection. I was wondering, like, well, why would we ask a question? But yeah, I see the point. I see the point now. I did a few streams about COVID though, in late night coding, or late night science talk. You can look them up on YouTube. But generally, I tend to talk about computer graphics and visualization here. So, any questions? Doesn't seem to be the case. Then I guess that's it for today. Next session, which is gonna be on Thursday, early in the morning, which translates to 9:15 to be precise. I want to talk about Reyes, which is a rendering system that is used, or it's a rendering algorithm to be more specific. And RenderMan is a software implementation of Reyes that is used by companies such as Pixar, which has been bought by Disney. So I suppose Disney Animation uses it, and ILM uses Reyes. So it's kind of an alternative to rasterization and ray tracing, but it's actually a rasterization. But it's a pretty fancy and a pretty open and extensive take on rasterization that is specifically tailored towards movie production. And Reyes is old. It's from the 80s, but it still exists in RenderMan in the software. That is being used again by ILM, Industrial Light and Magic, and Disney Animation, Pixar. Okay, so that's what I want to talk about in the next session. Yeah. So I mean, it's one digit, right? Reyes doesn't care about software or hardware rendering. It's just a concept. Okay, so it's mostly it's mostly hybrid, I guess. So it of course makes use of hardware resources. But Reyes itself is independent, just like rasterization or ray tracing per se is independent of whether it's executed on a graphics card or on a specific accelerator card or not. So Reyes is just a concept. But it's if you have to make it, if you look at Reyes, and you can see that on Thursday, or in the video on demand stream, you'll see that it's relatively close to what we call rasterization. Yeah, it's a technique. It's an algorithm, and RenderMan is a piece of software. That piece of software is probably an understatement. It's a gigantic piece of software. RenderMan is an implementation of Reyes. Plus, I mean, it has made significant advancements over the last couple of decades, plus a lot of other stuff. But funny enough, that other stuff has been considered in Reyes. And what I like about Reyes, that's why I present it. It stands for Render Everything You Ever Saw, by the way. So it's a very humble name. But what's really cool about this is, it's a pretty old technique, or the basic idea is very old. But it's passed the test of time. It's still being used today, and the reason is because it's designed in a way that it does work, but it's open enough and it's general enough so that it can accommodate a lot of other ideas, and basically just use more modern techniques that folks came up with in the last couple of decades and still be around. Okay. So that's Reyes. That's next topic, and that was advanced image synthesis for today. There don't seem to be any questions anymore. So yeah, see you again on Thursday if you want to, either advanced image synthesis, or we've got the introduction to programming coming up, and we've got late night coding with, I guess this time we'll finally get to compression if streaming works. Until then, as usual, stay healthy. If you can, get your vaccination. So here we got a COVID topic. If you haven't done so, see you. Bye-bye.